Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show of this week. So, in January 1945, Soviet forces crashed into the Third Reich from the east. Breslau, then part of Silesia, now Wroclaw in Poland, was one of Hitler's fortress cities. Richard Hargreaves, author of this book, to which there are links in the description below, but there are other different versions of it earlier and later, blah, 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 returns to the channel to tell this epic story. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Richard. How are you today?
Good evening. Very well, thank you. It's a glorious day. Well, it was. It's gone. The sun's gone down now, but it was a nice
It's dark and miserable here. So I included this in my Eastern Front series, but it's kind of, I always feel, is that really Eastern Front or not? Because once you get into kind of Poland or Romania and Hungary, it's like
Battle of Germany.
yeah, it's sort of an Eastern Front in that units have come from the east, but it doesn't feel like a Western battle either, does it? So it's
it's a sort of last gasp of the Vistula Oder operation.
yeah.
In a nutshell.
It's complicated. Anyway, we'll bring up your slide. So, folks, if you've got any big questions about perhaps Hitler's fortress policy or what the Soviets are doing broadly in early 45, we'll kind of save those ones to the end. But if you've got ones pertaining to the slides Richard is showing, then we'll do those as we go along. But basically, I'm going to hand it over to Richard to take us through this. And I was there in Wroclaw last year in November, so it's I'm really looking forward to this one. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I thought I'd start off with why. Oh, well, here's a collection of books on Breslau, including my own, which is as you've shown, it's from various formats. It's quite a popular subject. It sort of vanished for many years. So the Germans did quite a few memoirs, particularly. So Kanth Breslau is the one by the two fortress commanders. There's one, but there's quite a lot by priests because there's a lot of priests in the pocket. And then it sort of disappears, and that's from the 1960s, pretty much to really post-Cold War. And it's only then when Microcosm, which is the superb book on the city in general, by Roger Morehouse and Norman Davis, that they sort of look at the city as a sort of typical Middle Eastern European city. But the opening chapter is about the siege in 1945. And that was sort of what got me semi-started on the book, because I thought it was a fascinating subject. And at the same time, I also came across, whilst at the Imperial War Museum, this particular tome, which is the Bible for anybody who's going to tackle this subject. It's written by an ex-Hitler Youth guy who served as a messenger in the battle. And he spent basically 15-20 years compiling every imaginable account, photograph, map of the battle, and there's nothing like it I've ever seen in my entire life. It runs to 12,000 pages.
Good grief!
And there are 14,000 documents in it. And it's diaries, it's first-hand accounts, it's newspaper cuttings. Some of it's really bizarre and of no use, and other of it is stuff that is absolutely you will not find anywhere else. And nobody can tackle Breslau without referring to this book. So I have a complete set, which probably costs. It's quite hard to pick up in a full set. Can be anywhere up to £1,000. You might you might get 350, 400, and it takes up a hell of a lot of space, and it's very heavy, and it takes a lot of reading.
I'll stick to just yours and Rogers. I think that'll do me. Yeah.
And the chap himself, he died not that long ago, but yeah, he lived a very fruitful life as I think a botanist or something post-war. So completely different. But mid-80s, he sat down and thought, I'm going to chronicle the fall of the city. So January 3 at the end of the year, every day. You want to know what happened on Breslau on a particular day, you go to his book. So that's my sort of source material, and you cannot touch this subject without it. And the other reason why I did Breslau was because it's a forgotten battle, and it's a really interesting battle, not because of the fighting itself, but because for me it's like the Battle of Berlin in miniature. You've got all the players, but they're sort of the secondary actors. So you haven't got Hitler, you've got Karl Hanke, you've got the lesser generals, the lesser leaders, but you've got all the drama, all the horrors, all the interesting, all the things you expect to find in a good drama. I would love to see the subject turned into a film. because I think it's worthy of anything like Downfall. It would be a great subject for a story. Sorry, for a movie. So let's move to the city itself. This is a general view of early 20th century. I've collected quite a few postcards. So this is the heart of Breslau, turn of the century. So you have the Ring, which I believe is the second largest public square in Europe after Krakow. And it's still the heart of the city today. Thankfully, post-war, the Poles rebuilt it pretty much as it was beforehand. They did a really good job because it was, although it was damaged, it wasn't quite as flattened as other parts of the city, as we'll come on to. So this puts the city sort of in context. Apologies, this isn't the greatest map, but I lost all my maps on Breslau in a computer crash a few years ago, most annoyingly. But this sort of shows you western Lower Silesia. So to put it into context, Posen is about is only really an hour and a half drive from Breslau today. It's really not that far. To the east, you've got the heartland of the industrial part of Silesia. So your Krakows, your I can never pronounce it. Chenstochova, which is famous for its Black Madonna and that sort of thing. Really not that far away. And then, but apart from Breslau itself, most of this is rural, so it's much less industrial. Breslau is a big industrial city. Turn of 1930, 1940, it's about 600,000, 650,000 people. It's in the top 10 cities in the Third Reich in terms of size. It's got all the trappings of what you would expect of a major city of that era. So, it's got its own airport. It's got good transport links. Maintains them today. The railway. I think you express train to be in Berlin 2.5 hours. And then we'll come on to some of the sort of famous sites in the city. Do they get involved in the fighting? Most of them don't really. They become victims of the fighting. So it's mainly bombing and bombardment. So the cathedral, this is how it was. Again, pre-war. This is again today because they finally got around to replacing the turrets. I think post Cold War, because for a long time it was just the stumps of the towers, but didn't actually bother with replacing the final tops. We got the Rathaus, which is absolutely stunning, and behind in the distance you'll see the sort of modernist. The post office savings bank. That's still there, so that survived the battles pretty well. Again, the Rathaus was damaged, but rebuilt in a very, very respectful way, pretty much as it was pre-battle. This is the Liebigshöhe, which is a sort of pleasure gardens where you would 19th century you go there for listening to bands and sort of public entertainment. There'd be cafes, people go for a stroll, etc., which is very nice. But more importantly, underneath this is the headquarters of the siege. So this is where von Alphen and Niehoff direct the battle from, not from Hanke's headquarters, which is elsewhere in the city centre. They direct it from the bowels of here until really about the final few weeks of the battle, and then they move to what they think is a more secure location, not far from the cathedral. In fairness, they didn't really need to move because the battle never actually gets to the heights and never gets this far into the city centre. This is still there today. It's partially been restored. I think the last time I went there, the part of it was a sort of a Soviet-themed nightclub. I don't think the tower's been rebuilt, but certainly the sort of colonnade and everything is still there, and that's on the southeastern edge of the city centre. So still there. Then we get into the modernist era. Bit of a trek out of the city centre, but it's definitely one of the iconic buildings of Breslau, and it's still used today as a concert hall, exhibition centre, etc., etc. Built right on the eve of World War One. And although it doesn't really play a part in the battle, it does, because this is where Karl Hanke flees from at the end. But we'll come to that in due course. Okay, so Breslau under the Nazis, it's actually quite a Nazi city. Certainly 1933 is. Over 50% in 1933 is a very high percentage. 1933 elections, the Nazis on the decline. So it's quite unusual to get 50% of the vote in Breslau. Then again, if you look at the figures, unemployment 10%. Some of the accounts I found, sort of looking back into life in the city back then, it was really, really desperate. You can see why some people voted for Hitler. When half of the kids go to school barefoot, and there's people crammed into single rooms just to survive. It's pretty grim conditions, and they choose for a desperate option. This is, I think, Hitler's probably last visit to Breslau, which is the summer of 1938. And 1938, they have what I can only describe as the German Olympics, which is the sports and Turnfest. And this is staged in the appropriately named Hermann Göring Stadium, on the edge of the city. And although it's a celebration of German athletics and German athleticism and how Germans are supermen and superwomen, because obviously they're racially better than anybody else, it's also used as a massive propaganda event to highlight the plight of the Sudetenland, because Sudetenland is literally 50 miles to the south. So the Sudetenlanders are all invited to come along, and this picture here shows Sudetenland women clamoring for Hitler as he stood on the dais in the Schlossplatz in the sort of south of the city centre. Basically, I would say this is probably the high point of Breslau in the Third Reich. This is the moment; it's the centre of attention, and it's about as popular as Hitler's ever going to get. And and then war comes 1939. The front with Poland's really not that far away, but it's pretty much largely spared the war. The Russians make a quite impressive bombing raid in November 1941, kill about half a dozen people. But given how far the Soviet front is away by then, to hit Breslau, I think is a pretty impressive achievement. Then they're not the RAF, they don't have the long range bombers. So, but apart from that, and obviously there are, I think there's 2 major divisions raised in the city. So obviously the widows of them are a constant presence around Breslau, but it's largely escapes the war. It becomes very much a centre for sending children, in particular, who are from the bombed out areas in the west of Germany. So it becomes a sort of haven for them. Hence, it becomes known as the sort of the air raid shelter of the Reich. Quite a lot of their parents come in as well. And so, here we have the children, all the suits and the thing, suitcases and thing, being sent to escape the bombing in the west and live a safer life in the country. And it is a safe haven until really late in the war. I mean, we're talking August 1944 when they actually start to take World War II seriously in Breslau. And even then, the leader of this, the leader of the city, Karl Hanke, he's not massively interested, and he only really gets involved because he's told to by Hitler. So, come August, September 1944, there is a massive operation. This goes through most of the major population centres on the eastern front. So the same happens in Königsberg and around East Prussia, and I think again around Poznan and Posen, which is a massive digging effort, much like the citizens of Moscow did in 1941. They all pile out, spend 10-12 hours digging anti-tank ditches, trying to help create makeshift field fortifications, and it's a big operation. There's 100,000 people involved. Yeah, 100,000 people involved. In digging a ditch 20 feet wide, 13 feet deep. That's the main ditch, and it stretches for quite a distance. So we're talking, a big area.
Hmm.
A lot of people uh, I think a lot of it is propaganda in the terms of it's rallying people to here's the seriousness of the hour. Thou shall, get involved in the project, because if you need to realise that Germany is under threat, and therefore you must get involved. This is total war. Is there a defensive role in it? Well, there are German officers sort of overseeing or monitoring the digging effort, but they're pretty skeptical. I think one of them says to one of the diggers, "It's wonderful that you're working, but it's all for nothing." Another one says, "I can see this holding the Russians up for 32 minutes. They'll spend 30 minutes laughing at the defences, then 2 minutes crossing them." Um, so they're pretty skeptical. And when it comes to the actual battle in the winter, it's been a complete waste of time, because the bottom line is the ditch is filled with snow, so they literally just drive straight over it when the Russians come. So yeah, it's a complete waste of time, but it keeps a lot of people busy, and there's huge propaganda efforts in terms of, you see articles in the newspapers, on the weekly newsletter, and at the same time, or sort of October 44, you've got the raising of the Volkssturm, and now how many figures? I've got the figures here. It is 40 battalions are raised across Lower
Wow.
Silesia. Well, which is a lot of, battalion can be anything up to 600 men. One slight problem with all that is they don't have any weapons. So you're talking basically captured weapons, French rifles, Italian rifles, if they're available, maybe a handful of bullets per rifle. Some people are sharing rifles, some people are sharing bullets. Yeah, it's really not a well equipped force, and that's fairly standard for the Volkssturm anyway. The one thing they do have in massive numbers is Panzerfaust,
Right.
the anti-tank bazooka, one shot, and I can see why the Panzerfaust is popular and issued so widely. It cost 8 Reichmarks to make, which is absolute peanuts. You can make one every 53 minutes, and compare that with, well, T-34 took 13,000 hours to build, and cost 180 Reichmark. So compare tanks with cheap anti-tank weapons. You can see why. There's minimal training needed. And at the same time as the Volkssturm's being formed, we have, like most cities in the east, we have Breslau being declared as a Festung, and it's got a Festung commander who's an elderly chap called Johannes Krause. He's not there for that long. He's pretty ill and sickly. He's an artilleryman. He goes really sort of January, February time. So he sort of semi lays the groundwork, but he doesn't have much to do. The only thing he does do is he basically tells Karl Hanke, the Gauleiter, that this isn't a fortress, which it isn't. There's, unlike many of the cities in Eastern Europe, there's no real ring of fortifications. There's a few leftover defences from the First World War. There's a sort of north of the city, but there's nothing like, if you go to Poznan, there's a massive ring of forts around there, which would play a major part in the battles in February 45. There's nothing like that in Breslau. There literally is a city. There were some Napoleon defences in the city centre. They were blown up in the 19th century because the city had outgrown them. So what you have is a Wehrkreis headquarters for the local sort of raising of troops, and a few arsenals and depots and that sort of thing, but nothing in the way of a fortress. And Krauser basically says, if we are going to defend this place, the first thing you need to do is to evacuate 200,000 people and certainly make plans for them. And Karl Hanke refuses, and this will come back with a vengeance in time. So, Vicious Road Operation, which Pritt Butters in an excellent book on just in the last couple of months called Into the Reich, deals with much more detail than I can hear. But effectively, this is probably, I would say, probably even bigger than Bagration in the summer of 1944 in terms of killing Germans. The losses for the German army in 1945 are unbelievable.
Yeah. It's like the sequel to Bagration with a bigger budget, It's like,
in the cold.
And is there just a quick question for you? Is there any sense that it might be kind of bypassed? Because the Soviets are really kind of employing what Eisenhower would have called a kind of broad front strategy. They're kind of just pushing west from north to south over those thousands of miles. But is there any sense that there might be a bigger push either somewhere north or somewhere south? Or is it just a sense of inevitability that there will be an army coming towards them?
There's a mix of, I would say, inevitability. So the ordinary Breslau, and in fact the ordinary German, sort of expects the Russians to come. And the people who don't are the Nazi diehards who just basically just la la la, they're not coming. Almost, it really is fingers in the ear time, and this persists really right until the enemy's at the gates. They really don't prepare realistically for any evacuations, any sense of siege, and it's just it really is. It's about the worst leadership you can possibly have of any nation. It's dreadful. So the offensive, when it comes on the 12th and 13th of January, the defenders actually do a pretty good job for a couple of days. But once they break through the sort of crust of the defense, then it's a knife through butter time. I mean the speed at which they drive across Poland, it's literally city after city falls day after day. So there's a famous quote about from Guderian, who's the chief of general staff at the time, telling Hitler that the Eastern Front is like a house of cards. And Hitler, obviously, as usual, tells it's a gigantic bluff, and nothing's going to happen, etc., etc. And when it comes, it's Guderian who's bang on. So January the 15th, Kielce, or Kiel, I can never pronounce it, falls. Next day, Czestochowa. That's 90 miles from Breslau. Day after that, Warsaw's gone. A couple of days after that, they're in Krakow. So you can see the war's getting closer and closer and closer. So it captures. So here we have a cracking picture of people in Czestochowa or Czestochowa, looking at a knocked out tank. I think it's tiger. I don't know if it's a king tiger or just an ordinary tiger, because I'm not a tiger expert. And the Volkssturm is thrown in. So the Volkssturm is never really meant for combating the Red Army in open field, but there's nothing left. So they're thrown into battle piecemeal, in the same way that you would throw an infantry unit or a cadet straight out of cadet school, etc., etc. So and they are absolutely mauled. So this account here from a Silesian Volkssturm commander, this guy called Otto Albrecht. He was actually committed sort of near Poznan, but it gives a good indication of just how unprepared, unready they were. And it's I would say it's men against boys. It's more old men against men, and they are steamrolled. So January 1945, the German army loses 450,000 dead. That's in east and west, but I'm guessing that most of that is in the east, because post Ardennes, it's much quieter in the west. Obviously, And also, there's mass surrenders or there's bigger surrenders in the west rather than in the east, where there's pretty much no surrenders. And that figure, 450,000, continues every month until the end of the war. So you were talking nearly 2.5 million, or certainly 2 million German soldiers killed in the final 4 months of World War II, of which my guess is 75% of those are in the west. So yeah, here we have. I think this is possibly in the outskirts of Breslau. But yeah, captions and good imagery are not, certainly from the German side, are not in abundance in 1945. We are very much reliant on the Russians for imagery. And it's really once they start seeing first the troops and then the public, the Great Trek as it's called, coming through the towns and cities, from villages further east, that people start to realize that the war is right on the doorstep, and the Russians are coming. And yeah, the bizarre thing is, yeah, I mean, town called Ulst, which is 15 miles east of Breslau. Even as these treks are coming through, the Nazi leadership is holding the annual pig festival, where they slaughter all the pigs and have a big celebration and eat lots of sausage, and then planning for the Shrove Tuesday celebrations in February, which by then the town will have long been in Russian hands. But this is a sort of blind eye to reality, which goes through the Nazi leadership all the way through. And so really the evacuations are not driven by party leaders. They're not driven by the army. They are driven by individuals literally just upping sticks and moving west as fast as they can, which is horrendously slow. I mean, the average speed is about 2 to 4 miles an hour, these things. And most people are not in horse-drawn carts. Most people are on foot. They are taking, they take initially whatever possessions they can carry, but increasingly they just abandon that and flee with their bare lives, because it just takes they just can't carry it all, and there's very little provision made for them. So there's not like field kitchens feeding them. It's only really when they start getting to Breslau that there's some sort of Nazi welfare that looks after them. So Lena Aschner here is working at the central station in Breslau. And from January 17th, they are working around the clock to deal with the flood of refugees. And this is where the war comes to Breslau.
That's a very poignant quote. That is, I mean, not that I have necessarily have empathy for the Germans, but just human plight is human plight. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you now have in wintertime what happened to the Poles in September 1935 and the Russians in June, July, September, etc. 1941. You have this played out, but you have it played out in winter, and the temperatures are minus 15, minus 20 Celsius, and yeah, there's really, beyond the NSV, the welfare organization, there's really not much provision made for these people. The lanes of Lower Silesia are literally littered with personal possessions initially, and then it turns into frozen bodies because they fall by the wayside. People just become apathetic and just give up, and nobody cares for them. Their bodies are simply left there, and it's quite often, sometimes it's March or April when the thaw comes along, that the bodies are uncovered. So you have this sort of double horror of the initial deaths, and then you have the hideously mutilated bodies reappearing a couple of months later. Worst of all is, certainly the worst of all that I came across is the Kanth Death March, as it became known. So on January the 20th, the party leaders in Breslau finally go, "Ooh, this is looking quite bad. Please, all women and children and old people, evacuate the city. Please head to Kanth," which is about 10, 12 miles to the southwest, get my directions correct. So it's not far away, and I presume the idea is from there they will be evacuated on further west, because for some reason it's better prison. Quite why they said they can't, I'm not quite sure, because it's a pretty small town. But anyway, they all start heading out. So yeah, 15 miles away from Breslau, and there is literally nothing for them. So there's no transport provided. There's no field kitchens underway. There's no clothing. So they literally head out on foot, occasionally with horses and carts, but most people are pulled in hand carts like this. And about 60,000 people do this trek, and they're dealing with so excuse me, temperatures -15 to -20, and only 42,000 people make it. So on a 15-mile stretch of road, you have in the region of 18,000 corpses.
Good grief! Yeah,
which is a road of death. Like, it's up there with some of the roads I dealt with in Belarus in 1941 for the sheer levels of death. And I haven't included it in this presentation, but there's a really long letter by a woman who describes the death of her baby child, whom she tries to keep warm all the way through. She's looking for milk, can't find it anywhere. When she finally finds the milk and finds somewhere warm, the child has died. The plight of one sort of stands for many, but there are frequent accounts of people leaving their children in the snow and trying to make an escape because they can't care for them, they can't look after them, and a few sort of days later, the clearance parties are sent down the road to recover the corpses or to clear the road for further evacuations. And there's a horrific account by a BDM girl, sorry, the female version of the Hitler Youth, and she joins some sort of elderly truck driver, and they're driving down the road in the dark, and the lights cast on some obstruction in front, and he tells her to get out and clear those children's toys from the road. He thinks they're dolls. She climbs out the truck, gets in the road, gets up to the dolls, and realizes they're not dolls, that they are babies that have just been left in the middle of the road. And for the rest of her life, she cannot look at a doll because she's so traumatized by this scene that it just causes her to have an absolute breakdown whenever she sees dolls, because it reminds her of this moment. So she grows up and has kids herself, but there are no dolls in the house. That is the impact on the individual of some of this stuff. So January 22nd is the moment that really Festung Breslau begins, and Karl Hanke decides that this is the moment he's going to make his stand. Men of Breslau, thou shalt all stand together and fend off the Russian hordes. So what's he got at his disposal? Well, he's got about 25,000 troops, but it's a real mishmash rabble. Police, soldiers, stragglers. There's some Waffen-SS, there's Volkssturm. They're fairly well equipped with weapons. 11,000 Panzerfaust, which generally actually don't become that much use because there's not much armor used in Breslau when the fight comes in. As 1,200 machine guns. There's a few artillery pieces, but not a lot. And as I said, there's no real fortress as such, so they begin fortifying the city in makeshift fashion. So they literally rip Breslau apart by pulling up the roads, so pavement slabs, trams, trees, gravestones, you name it, is piled up to create makeshift barriers in the streets. And this gives you an idea roughly of the sort of the area we're talking about. So the fighting doesn't really get this close into the city centre, but this is where the battle's driven from. So Festung headquarters in the Liebigs on the sort of southeastern edge of the city centre. Dominsul is Cathedral Island, where the cathedral is today, still is today. The Freiburger Bahnhof is on the western edge of the city centre. That's where a lot of the evacuations took place from, particularly in the final days before the place is encircled. Schloss Pass is where we saw the Sudetenlanders meeting Hitler. It becomes basically a big vehicle park during the siege where sort of armor and trucks and things are parked. The ring, and then the main railway station on the sort of southern edge of the city centre. And just on the edge of this, because it's a zoom in from, I think, from Russian map, is the final front line, where it was on May the 5th or 6th, 1945. So they got within about 1.5, 2 kilometres of the city centre.
Mm.
And obviously, right in the middle, you've got the big blue strip of the River Oder, which is why Breslau was there in the first place, because it was settled as a crossing roughly around the Cathedral Island back at the turn of the millennium, going back a long, long time. So here are our leaders. Karl Hanke. What can I say about Karl Hanke? It rhymes with Hanke, I can safely say. Karl Hanke is a strange character. I don't despise him as much as some Gauleiters. Why do I say that? Because I say he's not a fair weather Gauleiter. Now that's good in some ways because he's loyal and he's trustworthy. You look at most of them in 1945 and they cut and run. So as soon as the Russians, or in the West, the Americans and British appear, the Gauleiters are first to raise the flags or run off bravely. So you have Arthur Greiser, who is a absolute shit of the First Order from West, from Poznan. He cuts and runs, and Goebbels is all for stringing him up. The Governor General of Poland, Frank, he runs straight away as soon as the enemy's at the gates. It's pretty much everyone just runs, and Karl Hanke doesn't. So I sort of admires the wrong word, but
I have that same feeling about like the SS commanders who still act like an SS commander even when they've been taken prisoner. And I still hate them, but I sort of begrudgingly respect them for at least kind of sticking to their albeit shit ideology. They don't. I know it's hard to convey what I mean by that, but the ones that just go and hide in a corporal's uniform and fuck off, that they seem even worse. Weird because they're cowardly.
Yeah.
At least these shitheads are loyal to their shitheadedness till the end. It's not something to admire, but I know exactly what you mean, Richard. I had the same inability to articulate what I mean.
Karl Hanke is not a coward. He is a brutal, murdering bastard, and I hate the man with passion because without Karl Hanke there would be no Festung Breslau. The city would fall as quickly as all the other ones in the east, with the exception of Poznan. Poznan's the only one that holds out, and that's because the army stands firm. See the comments.
Billy's adding that they're running away. I swear,
there are very few Gauleiters who are true to their loyalty to Hitler in 1945 and stand firm. So Karl Hanke, he's not from Breslau. He's not a Silesian. Like most Nazis, he's a nobody becomes a somebody thanks to the Nazi movement. So I think he's a technical school teacher who sort of makes his name in Berlin. He's really there because he's friends with people. He's friends with Speer and he's friends with Goebbels. Well, he's friends with Goebbels until he ends up shagging his missus.
That came up in a sidebar, didn't he? Have an affair?
So at the same time as Goebbels was shagging his way around German Hollywood in 1938, Karl Hanke is having an affair with Magda Goebbels, and Goebbels really isn't too chuffed by this. So he basically kicks him out of the propaganda ministry where he's been serving. Well, he doesn't. He sort of more sidelines him. So Hanke scurries off and joins the army and serves with aplomb. He serves in 3rd Panzer Division in Poland, and then he gets a plum position in 1940 because he's Rommel's adjutant in 7th Panzer, and he saves Rommel's life at one point during the fighting, for which Rommel was gonna put him forward for an award. And Hanke, being Hank, basically tells him, "Oh, I'm more senior to you because I'm in the party and I'm high rank." At which point, Rommel quickly withdraws his recommendation, so he doesn't get the gong for saving Rommel's life. Which, yeah, good on Rommel, I say. But it sort of sums up Hanke that he's a jumped up tosser, basically. And that's basically the end of his military career. So, January 1945, they split the Silesian Gau between Lower and Upper, as far as I remember. And Hanke is put in charge of Lower Silesia, which he makes headquarters in Breslau. And he's really not very popular. Most people, he's not a native, so that doesn't endear him to the locals. He's a really poor public speaker. He's brutal. I mean, the phrase that pops up quite often is a carbon copy Hitler. Obviously, without all the charm of Hitler, because Hitler was a lovely man. And he's ruthless. So he quickly clears Breslau of Jews, and at least 1,000 political prisoners are killed by Hanke or under his direction in the 3.5 years that he's in charge. No, 4.5 years in charge. The first, well, certainly one of the most brutal of the killings is the deputy mayor of Breslau, who he's a sort of financial official, so he's more career civil servant than Nazi. It's called Wolfgang Spielhagen, and he sort of fled Breslau because basically he had no more work to do in the city. There was no financial department because the city's under siege. So he goes with his family to Berlin, makes himself available to the party leadership, sir, saying, "Hey, look, I'm here. If you need me, assign me to something." They say, "Nothing doing." So he goes back to Breslau, at which point he's quickly arrested by Hanke for desertion. And then he's tied to a truck, driven around the city centre, on the back of it being hauled along, and then he's finally shot in public, in full view. Hanke makes no secret of this. He's clearing the decks. He's basically saying, "I'm in charge. I am the ruler of Breslau, and nobody else can challenge me." And he basically coins the phrase, which becomes sort of the motto of the siege: "He who fears an honourable death dies in disgrace." And that's what he assigns to Spielhagen, and that is parroted by von Alphen and Niehoff, both of whom are journeyman commanders. They're not, they're not grade one. They're not your Mansteins or your they're pretty. I think both pioneers or infantry leaders. They're nothing special. Certainly, and it's never really explained why Alphen goes. He obviously didn't get on with Hanke, but there's no real sort of documentation as to clashes between the two, or not much anyway. Niehoff comes in beginning of March, can't really do much, but he basically just parrots the party line until the end of the siege. But in terms of leadership, they don't really have to do much because, well, Hanke's in charge, and they basically just follow his line. Gone too far. So mid-February, we have the Red Army moving through the suburbs of the city, which sparks a sort of final splurge of evacuations, and also final clearing of the decks in the city for preparations for siege. So one of the saddest things is around February the 10th, 11th, they kill all the animals in the zoo, because if they escape during the fighting, then you'll have lions and tigers and monkeys and wolves roaming the streets of the city. So exactly the same happens in Berlin during the bombing. So it's not unusual, but it's certainly the translating the account of I think it was the zoo director who had to do or had to accompany all the killings, if not carry them out himself, is one of the grimmer things that I've had to translate, because it's just it's just one list of deaths of beautiful animals after another. And then February 13th, the city's encircled. The Soviets link up about 8 miles south of the city centre. They've already sealed off on the northern side. and neither the attackers nor defenders expect to be a long siege because Breslau's not a fortress; it's only a fortress in name. Best estimates are about 150,000 people in the besieged area, of which upwards are 115,000 civilians. So the rest are troops, stragglers. So yeah, about this time there's about 37,000 men of fighting age in the city. And they are formed into a makeshift division called the 609th, as well as 38th Volkssturm units. And there's a few sort of straggler units, artillery, medical, there's a Waffen SS unit as well. And facing them, we have the Soviet Sixth Army under Vladimir Gluzgovsky, who's 41 years old from Georgia. He's been in the Red Army for 25 years, so he's a seasoned campaigner. He's got 6 rifle divisions under him, so that's about 50,000 men. So he from the start, he has the numerical advantage as well as the preponderance of artillery, armor. Yes, he's got 1,000. He's got 1,000 artillery pieces ranged around the city. Not got a lot of tanks because they're needed more for the push west into the heart of the Reich. And what's the strategy here? Well, from the Germans' point of view, it's basically delay the Red Army. Hold off enough troops in Breslau that it at least slows down the advance westwards by the Soviets in the same way and that goes for all the fortresses. That is the standard. And there's the dangling carrot of possible relief.
Although I was going to ask that because someone mentioned it earlier. I mean that the promise there, well, they're not being given a promise. They're being given a hint that if you do a good job and hold on, there might be some kind of mobile reserve that will come in and save the day. But that's happening up and down the front. It's false, empty promises. So these guys go into it knowing that it's going to be just, as you said earlier, that the only choice is that opportunity. The only thing you can do is just keep on going until you got no bullets or people left, and hope for the best.
And that is effectively the strategy in Breslau. It's and that's why people keep going. It's not because they expect relief; they keep going because they have to. They've seen the writing on the wall. They've seen what's happened to the other fortresses. They've seen what happened at Stalingrad. And Stalingrad is really the only one where they actually make a distinct effort to relieve the pocket. There's breakouts west, but there's never any talk in Breslau of a breakout. It's purely siege.
And we should make the distinction: it is the Soviets approaching you. It's not the Americans and the Brits. There are cities over to the west where, at least if you fall, you'll get a decent meal, go into, and there'll be some kind of civil affairs unit coming in and will help bring back order and food and rations. This is the Soviets coming. So even at this stage, there's a clear understanding of what that can potentially entail, as we're going to get to. I know.
I mean, I haven't really touched on the rapes and the atrocities. I mean, they're committed by both sides again. Obviously, more by the Russians simply because they're on the advance and they're paying back the Germans for what they did on Soviet soil 2-3 years earlier. The best I can say about it is that it's probably not as bad in Silesia as it is elsewhere. Certainly not as bad as in Berlin. But yet there are rapes.
Budapest. Yeah.
It's grim stuff. The Germans again don't exactly aren't blameless in this. So they quite often will booby trap. Certainly during the advance on the city, in the villages, quite a lot of places are booby trapped. They will leave poison behind in wells, or in food in houses that they evacuated. So that there's quite often cases of sort of Russian soldiers being sat around a table, dead, having been poisoned, eating a fine German meal. Okay. And here we have a fairly iconic picture of a Russian soldier with his machine gun staring out over the spires and rooftops of Breslau. What's the fighting like? It's very much like Stalingrad, to be honest. The stakes aren't as high, obviously, because
Mm.
the war is effectively settled, and most people know it by then. But the actual fighting itself is brutal. It's house to house. It's room to room. It's yeah. So there's certainly plenty of accounts of, as in Stalingrad, of German soldiers on one floor in the basement and the Russians being above them. Um, People setting fires to burn people out of basements or smoke them out, grenades, etc. And at the same time, you have a very ruthless policy by the Germans that they need to clear entire blocks and streets of houses to create fields of fire for their guns. So the Russian attack is very much from the southeast. So it's the southeast of Breslau that suffers by far the worst of the siege. It shifts around Easter time to the west around the airfield, which is sort of northwest city centre. But certainly the bulk of the fighting is the south of the city centre, which is why if you go there today, it's the part of the city that's most utilitarian,
Yeah.
post-war Soviet blocks, etc. So yeah, they clear pretty much block by block. So people are given very short notice to evacuate. All their possessions are tossed out in the street where they're burnt. That rubble and detritus becomes part of the blockade. The houses are flattened again. That rubble assists the obstacle creation, and you've got your field of fire. And yeah, so this guy really Christoph paratrooper. So yeah, there is a real mishmash of units in Breslau. There were people from pretty much. I think the only people I didn't find were sailors, but there probably were some from some obscure Kriegsmarine unit. So yeah, this gives a pretty visceral description of life and fighting, and it is, yeah, you could say, is that from Stalingrad? Could be, because it's
Yeah.
very, very similar.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is armor committed. Here we have in Hindenburg Platz, which again is in the southeast of the city centre. But like I say, it's really the exception rather than the rule. The main weapons in Breslau are very much the improvised. So the city before the war was famous for its FAMO work. Oh no, sorry, Link Hoffman. I think there's one called Famine as well. FAMO, which are railway, carriage, and locomotive producers, and the workers there come up with this wonderful armored train which they build during the siege. So it's not like it's something that they've been working on for months. It literally is created during the siege, and it fights with aplomb. It's a fearsome beast. 488mm flak. So any armors coming up against that is going to have to struggle. It's got a couple of 37mm, plenty of 20mm, and it has a crew of about 100 running it, and it runs on the loop to the southeast of the city, basically popping up and trying to disappear into hiding as best it can. To support the troops on the ground. It does pretty well, but it suffers a horrific casualty rate. So 1 in 3 men crewing it will become a casualty, which is probably higher than the rest of the fortress. But there's lots of other sort of makeshift weapons. One of the favourite ones is something that the Germans call piss bags, which are bags filled with lye and tossed into cellars where the Russians were either living or fighting. And it basically acts like tear gas stroke mustard gas. So if you spend too long in there, you are going to suffer really quite badly, and it can kill if you're in the room long enough. And that's about as close as chemical warfare comes in probably in the Second World War, actually. But certainly It's used fairly commonly. As far as I can find out, the Russians didn't retaliate in kind. There's other bizarre weapons. So there are something called the Russians invent something called a land torpedo, which is tubes filled with explosives fired down the streets. Obviously, there's plenty of snipers that you see in Stalingrad as well. And there's a lot of harsh discipline on both sides to keep the troops in order. So executions for certainly for desertion, but also looting. Anybody who loots, and this goes to civilians as well. Anybody who loots in Breslau is going to be up before a firing squad pretty damn quickly. And it takes its toll. So really, Christoph again. Within, I think he spends about a week fighting in the basements, mainly of I think Western Breslau, from what I remember. But it's grim stuff, and the thing about Breslau is there's never any relief, day or night. There's always some noise, some fighting, some shooting. There's always searchlights reaching around the sky. There's always aircraft above, be it the Russians bombing or the Germans trying to resupply or take out wounded, etc. So yeah, it's a cacophony that never goes away. And on top of that, you've also got the loudspeakers. So you've got the Nazi loudspeakers providing the news via the wire radio network. As you get across the rest of Germany, you've got propaganda vans blaring things out, and then you've got the Soviets doing the same, saying, "Please surrender. We will treat you wonderfully," etc., etc. So it's a shame there's no newsreel or anything that captures the sound of Breslau, because it would be pretty horrific. So the water tower is one of the iconic features of the south side of the city. It still sounds like, I think it might even be a posh hotel now, but it's certainly been restored into full as it was sort of 19th century. But you can see from here this is the toll that the fighting takes on the city centre. And this is a city that at Christmas 1944 is about as undamaged by the Second World War as any city could be. Your Colognes and your Hamburgs have all gone. So Breslau still possesses that medieval heart with its Victorian or certainly 19th century additions. It's still a fine city with everything working, running. And by February, March, this is what it's looking like, certainly in the suburbs. So what's life in the city like for the civilians? Well, they're most living in the basements by now. So again, very much like Stalingrad, there are holes knocked through the wall again, so they can escape as quickly as possible if fires, etc., break out. Right at the start of the siege, the post office is still working as normal. There were 1,500 people working in the post office on February the 13th when the city's encircled, which seems utterly bizarre. But then again, mail is a fundamental part of morale, and it largely keeps running, certainly until Easter. There's a very good postal service. There are daily flights, or there are constant flights in, should I say, out of the airfield to the west of the city from Junkers 52s, delivering mail, delivering supplies, bringing in replacement troops, flying out evacuees, many casualties. The city was also pretty well stocked with food, so it's actually on that area, it is well prepared for a siege. So there are 32,000 halves of pigs, 150,000 rabbits, 5 million eggs. That's all in the warehouses when the city's encircled. Downside is electricity, fuel supply is spartan at best, pretty much non-existent towards the end. So no one clears the streets. So life quickly breaks down for the ordinary person. Obviously, there's no schools open. There's very few in the way of shops. At the airdrops, They reckon they evacuated 600 people, which give you, if you've been on a Ju-52, there's not a space on there. So they flew out a hell of a lot of people, particularly when you're thinking of casualties on stretchers. It's a pretty impressive subject. That takes place until March stroke Easter time, when Gandau, which is the airfield, becomes untenable because it's right in the line of fire. And yeah, and as far as sort of the Nazi Party goes, although Hanke rules with a rod of iron, day-to-day life people are much more practical than that. So nobody says Heil Hitler, or very few people say Heil Hitler. The main phrase is Bleib übrig, which is basically stay alive. That's their standard greeting in the fortress. And we talked about earlier about the propaganda. So it's less about relief. It's more about miracle weapons. So your V1s and your V2s will turn the tide of the war, and therefore the Allies will surrender rather than relief is coming. And side by side with that is you shall write a glorious page of history. So in 50, 100 years' time, people will talk about the siege of Breslau as if it's the 300 Spartans or that sort of type of thing. Who the hell wants to go down in history? You want to live, but that's the Nazi message that they're selling, which is fairly standard for all the diehards across Germany in 1945. And the one counterbalance to that is that the city is full of clergy. It's a very religious city anyway. I mean, you've been, so you know how many churches there are. There's a lot. And these guys do not flee their parishes. They stay with their flocks. And they become some of the best chroniclers of the siege. They become some of the biggest critics of the Nazi regime, obviously in private, because Hanke will definitely string them up if they don't. And eventually they become the sort of the moral advisors to the Festung commander, and basically persuade him to surrender right at the end. But during the siege, they are holding their services, sometimes still in their churches if they're still alive, even if they're damaged. Quite often, basements become makeshift places of worship. The basements also become makeshift brothels. So there's quite a few unscrupulous young women. They could be called bunker sweethearts, and they basically throw themselves at any soldier or basically anybody who's got food or alcohol to offer them. And as far as Hanke goes, he's still keeping his political prisoners. So there were still 250 people in the civic prison throughout the siege, and some are kept there to the bitter end, some are killed off. There's also 3,000 forced labourers in the city who've got to be guarded and watched. They're mainly Poles. They live in far worse conditions than even the grimmest conditions that the civilians live in, and there's no sanitary conditions for them. As to what they actually do, it's basically they're mainly employed, we'll come to this shortly, in building the runway that's never used. And hospitals, again, they're mainly moved to basements, or alternatively, they use the Hock bunker, the tall concrete air raid shelters, and they developed quite a good but grim method of treating the casualties, so that those nearest death are treated on the ground floor or near as the ground floor as possible, so that if you have to carry a corpse out, you don't have to go all the way to the top floor. So it's practical, but it's and these are the grimmest places imaginable. They are largely working under candlelight. There's no air conditioning. There's blood. There's a stench of gangrene. There's medics who are working absolutely round the clock. There are body parts lying around in buckets everywhere. It's if you wanted to paint a picture of Dante's Inferno, it's
yeah.
Okay. So this is I think this is Karl Hanke's last actual radio address, which early March. So they actually link up with the rest of Germany, and all the world is looking to to Festung Breslau. Well, really, they're not, but that's the impression he tries to give, because really by March 1945, it is looking like Berlin and what's going to happen there, and maybe the Western Front and the crossing of the Rhine. So when does Festung Breslau become an irrelevance? Probably about sometime in March, certainly after April.
Once we get into April, it's a damp squib, isn't it? Then, yeah.
So here we have a couple of Red Army images. The second one, sorry, the one left is probably the iconic image of Festung Breslau. I think, given the way it's composed, it's taken by the same chap who took the picture on the right, which is a guy called Dimitri Boltemonts. Who's he's quite famous, but he's not up there with, is it Chaldai, or some of them, or Grossman, or
Grossman,
the one on the right is called Tchaikovsky, Germany, 1945. And he literally found, supposedly he found half a dozen Red Army men sat around a stand-up piano in the ruins of a house. My guess is it's almost certainly posed. Having spent a 30-year career in journalism, most pictures like this are posed, so I'm pretty certain it's a stage fit picture. So he visits in March 1945. The Sixth Army is well served. It's got quite a few reporters. There's a guy called Vasily Malinin. He's the main correspondent, and he's the one whose diary I use frequently in the book to sort of to paint the picture on the Red Army side. Red Army accounts aren't, well, certainly when I was writing my book, weren't massively available. They've started to come available in the last 15 years, mainly translated to Polish. So that's my next task, is to have a look at those and see what they bring to the battle. But yeah, so they have their own newspaper, like most front newspapers, Down with the Enemy. And it's more than just a news. It's more than just a news sheet like most frontline newspapers. So it doesn't tell you what the day-to-day goings on in the world are. Yes, it does that, but it also gives you tips on how to fight in Breslau. And for regular students of World War II, they'll probably be used to seeing death cards.
Yeah,
which I think possibly also carried on post-war into civilian thing. Death in Breslau is like many things, ever present, and pretty rudimentary in terms of what happens to them. So in mid-March, there's one of the priests in his parish, in one of the parishes, a guy called Paul Pikert. He writes probably the best and account from a religious clergyman in the fortress, and he's uber critical of the Nazis, quite rightly, for the way they maltreat the people of the city. He's losing 60 parishioners a day in mid-March. I think the highest he recorded was 131. There's never a day in Breslau without death somewhere. Starvation, normally bombardment and buried under the rubble. And in terms of what happens to these bodies, well, they're buried between 6:30 and 8 a.m. because that's the only time the fighting's fairly quiet. So that's the least likely you least like to get shelled or bombed at those times. And so people are scurrying around the streets. They're trying to find any open space available. So it's green spaces in squares. The cemeteries have long been full, so they basically just dig up any space they can and bury the dead there. There's no ceremony to it. There's no religious. If you're very lucky, there might be religious service, but most of the time it's literally just bury them, get the topsoil over, and that's it. And some of these have been lying in the streets for several days, so the state of the corpses must be absolutely horrific. And here we have a condolence letter, which I managed to snap up on eBay, of a soldier who was killed in Breslau. And actually, no, we'll just go back a bit again. So we're now sort of through to about March. 1945. As I said, the siege of Breslau is almost an irrelevance apart from for those who were there. It's not really progressing anywhere. But then again, people are dying day in, day out. And mostly under threat now is basically the future of the fortress in terms of supplies, and replacements and evacuating casualties. So Gando Airfield in the northwestern edge of the city centre, it's about 2 or 3 miles out of the city. It's becoming untenable. The Russians have got such a preponderance of flak around the airfield now that 2 out of 5 Ju-52s coming in are being lost, and the Luftwaffe basically says, we can't keep doing this. We're going to run out of planes at this rate. So the solution is to flatten an entire district. So just north of the Cathedral Island was a long boulevard lined with grand tenement blocks, etc. And basically, the tenement blocks on both sides of that are flattened to create a runway, and it runs for a couple of miles up to a huge roundabout road junction called the Schweidnitzer Star or Stern. And they literally flatten everything there. So churches, factories, shops, all become victims of the Moloch of destruction. And they have 60,000 people working on this project. So it's pretty much every civilian plus the forced labourers, and all this rubble is flattened down and creates a runway, a roll felt, all of which is created under enemy fire. So of the 6,000 people, 3,000 are killed by the bombardments, and it takes really about 3 weeks to do this, 3 to 4 weeks, and it's basically, by the time it's finished, there's no planes to deliver anything, hardly anything lands in it, and basically the only thing that really lands in it are a few gliders, which deliver peanuts because their payload is much smaller than J-52, so there's virtually nothing coming in. So you flatten the district, you've killed 3,000 people, you create a wasteland, destroyed churches and cultural treasures and God knows what, all for naught, basically. And then we come to Easter 1945. Easter Day and I think Easter Monday, I think it's 2 days, is basically the death of Breslau. It's when the Russians submit it to, well, certainly on Easter Sunday, 750 bombers hit the city. So you're from dawn till dusk. It's absolutely hammered. And it leaves most of it, certainly many of the buildings burnt out. It's not quite the complete destruction of the city, because the Russians meant to do that after the siege, as we'll come on to. But it really does, it changes the face of the city forever. So the cathedral's burnt out, as are many of the other buildings on the Cathedral Island. The neighbouring Sand Island, that's left in ruins. Hanke's headquarters, they're left in ruins. Post office gone. The savings bank, the SSH quarters. The only thing that doesn't really happen on the siege day, on bombings, is deaths. So despite all this effort, because they're in their basements and their shelters, the people of Breslau are actually reasonably well protected. So only 130 people die, which, compared with other bombings around Germany, particularly at this stage of the war, where they are hitting cities with basically a Dresden every night. This is actually quite a low death toll, but it really does ruin the city. And hand in hand with the bombing is an attempt to attack or to break through the German lines. And it comes within a whisker of succeeding. And basically, von Niehoff, throws in his last reserves, which is basically a couple of Volksturm battalions in the west of the city, and that saves the day, and it stops the Soviet breakthrough, and that's basically the end of the siege, because for the next month, the the Russians don't really bother. They the, there's fighting on a day-to-day basis, and there's local skirmishes, but there's no concerted effort to take the city whatsoever, um, which is which in a sense I sort of get why they did it, because it's not going to gain them anything. Berlin is about to, the siege of Berlin's about to begin. There's nothing that can be really achieved other than killing more Red Army soldiers. So, yeah, basically the fighting stays roughly, and the front line stays roughly the same for the next month. So here is the map. Here's a Russian map here showing the line. You can just about make out the red line showing where the line, where the front is, and they never make really any attempt from the north to come in. They only start really eating in from the west, late March, April time. They never press from both sides. They never make an attempt to do a concentric attack on the city. If they'd have launched an attack in every direction at once, Breslau would have fallen probably very early on in the siege. But I don't know whether it's a lack of quality leadership, whether it's a lack of troops. But in the annals of the Red Army, the siege of Breslau is not a great military success. Okay, so it comes to, Hitler's dead now by beginning of May. That doesn't really resonate in the city. They're more bothered about their day-to-day existence than some bloke who's topped himself in a bunker in Berlin, however much he was beloved before the war. So they're more concerned about their day-to-day existence. They really, for most people, they see the death of Hitler as the last, or removing the last block to surrender. And that's pretty much what it is, because by the first week of May, the clergymen in Breslau are talking to each other. They're starting to talk to Niehoff about ending the siege. They're going behind Hanke's back, which is a brave but dangerous thing to do. And Hanke learns about this, and he learns that they're looking to end the siege, and he confronts Niehoff. And Hanke's absolutely furious, and threatens to arrest Niehoff, but Niehoff sort of stands his ground, and at that moment, Hanke does what all the other Gauleiters does, and he cuts and runs. He sees he sees a writing on the wall now, and he heads off to the Century Hall, the Jahrhunderthalle, which is still very much in German hands, where there is a Storch, the little small reconnaissance aircraft, which has been stored away for use by Niehoff.
For just such an occasion, yep.
Yeah, well, it was actually more for reconnaissance. But basically, he steals the aircraft, he grabs a pilot, orders him to fly him out. So at some stage, we don't know when, but we know that he flies out around June the 4th or 5th. He doesn't tell anybody he's doing it, other than the fortress gets a message a few hours later saying, "Oh, we've got your Gauleiter. He's safely arrived here. He's had a bit of an adventure, but we've got him." And that's basically his role in the siege gone. He's now out of the siege, and so the only person really who's in charge is Hermann Niehoff, the commander, and he is he's inclined to surrender. What happens to Karl Hanke? Well, there's a million and one stories, like many of these people who vanish into the mist of the chaos of post-war or post-surrender Germany. The most likely account, or the most likely fate, is that he sort of dresses up as an ordinary soldier, gets caught somewhere in the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and is executed whilst trying to escape as a POW, possibly because he's been recognised, or possibly because he's just trying to escape, full stop. But that's sometime in June. Nobody really knows when. His wife has him declared dead in the 1950s. So she's fairly convinced that he didn't escape and get to South America like some Nazis do. But there's never really a definite answer as to what happens to him. But with him out of the way, it's capitulation time. So May the 6th, Niehoff heads through the Soviet lines and he's led to a villa which still exists this day. I think there's a plaque on the wall, from what I remember, in the southern suburbs. One of the areas that hasn't been destroyed because it fell to the Russians before the fighting really got brutal. And the surrender itself is actually quite pleasant. They end up getting quite drunk. It's a bit of a party, and Niehoff thinks that he's actually got a fairly good deal from the Soviets in terms of the surrender terms. Although, as it turns out, they generally ride roughshod over most of the terms that he signed. But that's probably not down to Gluzdowski. It's probably more down to higher up in the Soviet machine. So, what does the siege of Breslau cost? Here's it in raw facts and figures.
Yeah.
And it's a German defeat on every level. It's not like the Russians beat their head against a battering ram and lost loads and loads of troops. No, it's very much a German defeat on every level. The civilian death toll is, I've seen anywhere from 10,000 to 80,000 quoted. Given that 18,000 died on the death march, I'm leaning towards the 80,000 as a 8,000 civilians percent. Not quite sure what that is. Obviously, a typo on my part. But yeah, it's horrific. As is the destruction of the city. So, if you were to walk around Breslau on May the 6th or 7th, 1945, it's a dead city. It's as destroyed as any city in Europe, pretty much. It's pointless making comparisons with Berlin or anything, but it's you look at those stats and go, wow. So. And then we have the Soviets quickly move in. Here we have them enjoying life in the ring. And as you see, this is May 1945. So the buildings are still standing. They were trucked around. The whilst the roadway has been carved up and it's just mud these days. The facades are still there. So the city centre is spared better than certainly the suburbs are. And as with all good citizens, the Breslauers string banners across the streets welcoming the glorious liberators of the Red Army, etc., etc. As we've seen time and time again with every invasion, and at the same time, so here they are enjoying the Schweinitzer. But there's really not a lot to do in Breslau in 1945 because, like I say, there's no shops, there's no public services running, and what there is a lot of alcohol, and they raid the beer and wine cellars, get absolutely hammered, and on May the 11th there's a second major conflagration. So we've had the bombing over Easter. There's a second burning of Breslau, which basically doubles the destruction that was caused during the actual siege itself. And there were literally fires going on really through most of the summer. This is an aerial shot taken by the Luftwaffe, I think, just before the end of the siege. In the background, I got the insert of the ring, and then as the Poles rebuilt it. Post-war, I mean, they did a very good job of restoring the old Breslau. So the first Poles move in literally within a day or two of the city falling, and they try to Polonize, for want of a better word, Breslau very quickly. So within 3 years, within 2.5 years, in fact, Germans are evacuated or driven from the city, and it's pretty brutal. The Vertreibung is, as they call it, is pretty ruthless. Is it as bad as the way the Germans treated the Poles and the Russians? No, but it's still pretty. You get a knock on the door at 6 a.m. and you're out of the house by 7 a.m. if not sooner, and you're packed in cattle trucks at the local railway station and sent west to an unknown destination. You've lost all your worldly possessions. You lost your home. So, I mean, in many ways, so you've gone through this siege. You survived the worst things imaginable, and it's all for absolutely nothing. Not only have you lost the war, but you've lost everything. You've lost your home.
Yeah.
You've lost your livelihood. You've lost all your possessions, your photographs. So the war spares the people of Breslau nothing. Having got to end of 1944 with a city intact and life as good as it could be in Germany in 1944. Within 6 months, it's turned its head and they suffer horrendously. And at the same time, we have Poles moving in en masse to try and Polonize the city. Because of the nature of the way the borders were redrawn at Gauleiter and then at Potsdam, Poland effectively shuffles west between the wars.
Yep.
So they lose Lvov and basically get Breslau as compensation is the best way I can describe it. I mean, I'm sure Polish historians will describe it much better than me and much more accurately. But it sort of becomes a second. So a lot of people who are kicked out of, a lot of Poles who are kicked out of Galicia make a second home in post-war Wroclaw as it becomes. And sort of the transformation in terms of how quickly Breslau becomes Wroclaw is astonishing. Within 12 months of the fall of the city, Poles outnumber Germans 6-1. That is how quickly they move in and claim the city for themselves. But it's a hard existence for them as well. I mean, let's make no bones about it. These are pioneering spirits who come west, and certainly that was the way it's portrayed. It's come west and rebuild. It's almost like 19th century America. Go west with your wagon carts.
Yeah.
It's very much colonize the West. There's land aplenty for you. There's work. There's farms. But what there isn't is a lot of law and order. There's certainly not. So it becomes known as the Wild West of Poland because there are shootings and lootings and murders. Obviously, most of that is directed initially at the Germans because they're the losers in the war, and they've obviously put down the Poles for 6 years of conflict, and the Poles are getting their revenge. But as the Germans move out, it becomes just general lawlessness amongst the Poles, and it takes a long time to rebuild the city, not least because, as in most cities post-war that were flattened, so all the ones that were bombed in the west, there are railway lines running down most streets, the Trümmerbarns, to remove the rubble, and there are thousands of people hauling the bricks and whatever it is they can salvage out of the ruins of Breslau into these railway carts. But the bricks don't go to rebuild Breslau; they are sent to rebuild Warsaw. So even by mid 1950s, it's way behind many other cities in terms of rebuilding. So cities in the west are starting to there's a lot of wasteland, obviously, but they're starting to see some sort of rebirth and new buildings. Breslau, it takes a really long time to get going. There's a few sort of flagship, quite impressive apartment blocks built near the railway station, which is still there today, but they're much showpiece, stylistic projects which they just can't afford. They take too long to build, too expensive, so they revert to what everywhere else in Eastern Europe does, which is utilitarian blocks of flats, cheaply built, cheaply erected, etc. And that's what you get. So and there's some of them are still there today. Thankfully, it's become a very modern city now. So
and it was I mean, our guide there was saying it was a really massive part of the anti-communism movement in the 70s and 80s, and it kind of, as you said, the population kind of reinvented itself and became very Polish and sort of a younger population, university city, and it was a real kind of radical, went through that crime period, kind of being a radical kind of avant-garde place, and now it's, our guy was kind of talking about all the different aspects of history, and he didn't have the same bitterness against the Soviets that perhaps someone in Budapest would have, where we'd been a year earlier. They felt that they kind of came out of it eventually not as bad as others, but worse than some, not as bad as others, but really interesting place. I just want to refer to some of the comments we had about earlier on, Richard, about the Soviets not bypassing it. Yes, why didn't they bypass it? And then someone said they did bypass it because at that point they kind of have the forces to do both, can't they? They can push on and also try and reduce Breslau.
Yeah, I mean, they only leave one army investing, which is the Sixth Army. Now they could have sent the Sixth Army west and committed it to and left an even smaller garrison force outside. But they have so many troops committed to the Berlin operation. It's 2.5 million troops in Berlin.
Yeah.
So 50,000 men outside Breslau really isn't going to cut it in terms of making a difference. So I see the siege of Breslau as an utterly stupid, pointless battle because it doesn't need to happen. It doesn't achieve anything other than it destroys a city, which could be it was known as the flower or the bloom of Europe before.
Yeah.
The Poles did a reasonable job in rebuilding it, but it would be lovely to see what it could have been. It makes me angry that all these cities are devoured by war, and Königsberg is probably the worst case because the Soviets really did trash that and then rebuilt it in hideous Soviet forms. At least in Breslau, they and the same goes in Poznan and Gdansk. They've rebuilt them, or they've certainly rebuilt the city centres in the old Gothic medieval style. And I would certainly encourage people to go there because it's a great city to visit.
Yeah, no, so we enjoy our time there. You mentioned the prisoners that were still being held under the siege there, and Jim asked, did the Soviets release the political prisoners who've been in prison? Do you happen to know that?
Well, they were sort of released themselves because the guards just disappeared. So,
okay, fair enough. Good point.
So in the final day, in the final sort of hours, once Hanke had went, then that's it. That's the end of all sort of ruled by the Nazis in Breslau. So the prisons, and the same goes in Berlin. They're just left to their own devices, so they just slip out. How many were there at the end? I genuinely don't know because there's none on account left.
Okay.
But it was certainly in use pretty much until certainly in April there were still political prisoners being held and they were still being executed for their crimes. And I use the word crimes very loosely because most of the time it's minimal looting or even just a snide remark about we're going to lose the war, etc. It's senseless killings like most of them.
And Dr. Phil Blood kind of basically agreed with you about the fact the Soviets never really put in their best troops. They don't commit to it fully. No. He said they operated like Mariupol, closed the city and bombarded it with constant local probes. Then later on, he added the Soviets sit and wait. It was usual Red Army operations until they decide where the main axis of operations will be. You see earlier on, I mentioned Budapest earlier, there because of the synthetic fuel that's beyond it and the route to Austria, the Red Army are absolutely going at that with everything they've got because they really, really need it. But it always feels a bit like the third and fourth final playoff in football terms. It's not going to change the outcome of the war.
Yeah.
It's as you said, it's like a meaningless and yet utterly tragic on a human level battle. It's not. Neither side is going to have that tactical victory that's going to make a difference to their eventual participation. Or it's just an unnecessary battle.
Yeah, and I mean, if you compare it with say Königsberg, where there are lots of fortresses around Königsberg, which do actually make it a proper Festung, but they make a concerted effort to seize the city, and they do seize it. They seize it a month before Breslau. So had they put the effort in, then they would have got Breslau. What it would have gained them, it would freed up 3,000 troops to support the march on Berlin, but it wouldn't have. The war would have ended still on. The siege of Berlin would still have ended at the same time. It wouldn't have made any real difference at the end of the war.
Yeah, no, that sort of happens a lot with the kind of 45 battles. Is that it's all just never going to have an impact. It's just delaying. Everyone knows what's coming. Everyone knows it, and it's just all wars, all battles, all years of the war have unnecessary deaths. But it seems 45. Everyone's like, come on, just cut to the chase now. There's nothing you can do. Let's go speed this to a conclusion. But anyway, it's been absolutely delightful talking to you, Richard. I'll hold up my copy of the book there. There are links to it. There are different
Polish.
Sorry, it's in Polish as well.
It's in Polish as well. I did a bizarre book launch surrounded by a load of Polish Waffen-SS reenactors.
Okay, that's worthy of a pub story sometime. Anyway, it's been delightful talking to you, folks. As always, don't forget to buy my guest books. Consider becoming a channel member or a patron, and read their books, read their blogs, etc., so they come back again. So I'll be back again next week. Lots of stuff. We've got some war crimes shows coming your way. We've got some sort of general battle shows. Lots of really good stuff coming your way. So as always, click like and subscribe, and I will see you all after the weekend. Cheers, Richard. Cheers, viewers. Thank you. Bye.